What if the most dangerous thing about you is not what you say, but what you never correct? Because silence lets people reveal exactly who they are when they think you have nothing to protect. I learned that lesson the year my husband died, the year grief hollowed out my chest and left behind a quiet that people mistook for weakness. Because when Harold passed after 48 years of marriage, I did not collapse the way everyone expected. I did not scream or demand attention. I simply endured, and that endurance would later confuse everyone who tried to measure me by appearances alone, because I was 78, widowed. Slow in the way old houses are slow, and according to them, harmless. Harold had always been the planner between us, the man who read contracts twice and trusted no one with money, not even family, and in the months before cancer took him, he made decisions quietly, carefully, transferring assets, closing visible accounts, selling properties under shell names, preparing for a future he knew I would face alone. And when he died, the truth landed on me without ceremony. I inherited $5.2 million in investments and property, clean, legal, and entirely mine. And the first instinct I had was not excitement or relief, but silence, because something inside me whispered that telling people would change the way they looked at me, and I was not ready to be looked at differently while my grief was still raw. So I told no one, not my friends, not my neighbors, not even my son, because grief sharpens instincts you did not know you had, and mine told me that secrets like locks exist for a reason. In the weeks that followed, my house felt unbearable. Every chair still held his shape, every mug remembered his hands, and when my son Thomas suggested I come stay with him and his new wife for a while, it sounded like kindness, like safety, like the sort of family solution people praise without thinking too hard, and I said yes because loneliness has a way of lowering your guard. At first, his wife welcomed me warmly, all smiles and careful touches, calling me by my first name instead of Mom, which felt modern and respectful, she said, and I believed her because I wanted to believe that my son had chosen well, that the world had not completely tilted against me. But kindness that is rehearsed never lasts long, and small things started changing in ways that were easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. My things moved without explanation, my routines interrupted for efficiency. My presence treated like clutter rather than comfort, and I told myself this was adjustment, that young couples needed space, that grief made me sensitive because it was easier to blame myself than to imagine intention. What they did not know, what they never once asked about, was how I paid the bills without asking for help, how the property taxes were always settled before reminders arrived, how the house they lived in had been purchased years earlier under a trust Harold, and I created long before Thomas met his wife, because Harold believed adulthood should not be handed over like candy, it should be earned. And I honored that belief by saying nothing. Silence became my armor, and armor is invisible until it is tested. A week after my son's wedding, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that made the air feel different, like pressure before a storm, because suddenly conversations stopped when I entered rooms, smiles tightened instead of widened, and concern replaced courtesy, concern that sounded like worry but felt like evaluation. I noticed how often my age was mentioned, how forgetfulness was implied even when I hadn't forgotten anything, how decisions were discussed around me instead of with me, and how often the word help appeared when no help was needed, because people who want control rarely announce it directly, they wrap it in kindness until you mistake manipulation for care. I kept my mouth closed and my eyes open, because when people think you are poor, dependent, and fading, they reveal themselves without restraint, and that is information more valuable than money. I watched my son grow quieter, his opinions softer, his posture slanted toward agreement instead of conviction, and I recognized something painful in him, fear not of me, but of losing his life as he knew it, because fear makes good people complicit when resistance feels inconvenient. His wife, on the other hand, grew bolder, her confidence rising with every unchallenged assumption she made about me, about what I owned, about how much I understood, about how little I mattered, and I realized then that being underestimated was not an accident. It was an invitation, one I had not sent but was now receiving. I smiled when spoken over, nodded when corrected, asked questions I already knew the answers to, because sometimes the safest place to stand is exactly where people think you're weakest, and grief had taught me patience in ways comfort never could. The truth is, no one ever asked me what Harold left behind. No one ever wondered how I survived without asking for anything. No one ever questioned why I never complained, because assumptions are easier than curiosity, and they are far more dangerous. They saw an old woman with trembling hands and slow steps, not a widow who had spent decades beside a man who believed preparation was love, and by the time the first real move was made against me. By the time intentions turned into plans, they were already too confident to notice how quietly I had been listening, how carefully I had been remembering, and how deeply they had misunderstood the woman they thought was standing in their way. Because the moment they decided I was powerless was the moment they stopped hiding what they were willing to do next. And that's when I heard her say something she never meant for me to hear, words that made it clear they didn't just want me quiet, they wanted me gone. Have you ever noticed how people speak differently when they believe you are invisible? How their voices lose politeness and reveal what they really think the moment they assume you no longer matter? That realization came to me on a quiet afternoon when the house felt unusually still, the kind of stillness that makes every sound sharper, because I had just finished folding towels in the guest room and my hands were still damp when I stepped into the hallway and heard my name spoken the way people speak of objects, not humans, casually, impatiently, without concern for how it might land. She was in the kitchen with my son, her voice low but careless, complaining not about traffic or work or weather, but about me, about how I was still here, about how I drained energy, about how old people linger too long when no one has the courage to say what needs to be said, and each word settled into me slowly, not like a slap, but like cold water seeping into shoes you can't take off. I stood there frozen, towel pressed against my chest, listening as if my body had decided movement was no longer safe, because sometimes survival means stillness, and stillness means you hear everything. She laughed softly as she spoke, the way people do when they feel justified, when cruelty feels efficient rather than cruel, and she said it might be time to do something, something that would give them their life back, something practical, something permanent, and my son didn't argue, didn't defend me, didn't even interrupt. He just sighed, the sound of someone who had already accepted the direction things were going. That sigh hurt more than her words because her contempt was expected once it surfaced, but his silence felt like a decision, and decisions have weight. I wanted to step forward then to announce myself, to remind them that I was not furniture or noise or inconvenience, but grief makes confrontation feel exhausting, and I understood in that moment that if I revealed myself too soon, they would simply adjust their tone, not their intent. So I stayed hidden and listened as she spoke about me like a problem that needed solving, a problem with a timeline, a problem that could be moved, managed, or labeled until it stopped interfering with her plans. She mentioned space, how the house felt crowded, how the future they wanted didn't include me hovering in corners, how children would come someday and there wouldn't be room for someone like me. And when she said someone like me, she didn't mean old, she meant inconvenient, because inconvenience is the one thing ambition never tolerates. My son murmured something about my feelings, about how I might not agree, and she dismissed it immediately, saying I wouldn't fight, that I was tired, that I was already fading, that people my age rarely push back when decisions are framed as help. And that was the moment I understood something critical. They were not reacting to me, they were planning around me. I backed away quietly, returned to the guest room, and sat on the edge of the bed with my hands trembling, not from fear, but from clarity, because clarity arrives suddenly when denial runs out of places to hide. I replayed her words over and over, not because I enjoyed the pain, but because I needed to understand the shape of the threat, and the shape was not emotional, it was strategic, wrapped in concern and presented as inevitability. From that day forward, the house felt different, like a stage set where I had unknowingly become the obstacle in someone else's story, and I began noticing patterns that once seemed harmless, how food was suddenly labeled and tracked, how my access to simple things required explanations, how my routines were commented on with exaggerated concern, how every small mistake was observed instead of ignored, cataloged instead of forgiven. She began asking questions she already knew the answers to, questions designed to test me, to see if I hesitated, if I repeated myself, if I showed signs that could later be used as proof. And when I answered clearly, she smiled in a way that felt disappointed rather than relieved. My son watched all of this with a distance that felt practiced, like someone who had learned to look away in small increments until looking away became habit. And I realized then that he wasn't cruel, he was convenient, and convenience is often more dangerous because it requires no effort to maintain. I started paying attention to how often she spoke for me, how she explained my needs before I expressed them, how she reframed my independence as risk, my quiet as confusion, my grief as instability. And I understood that she was building a narrative not for me but for others, a story where she was the responsible one and I was the problem that required management. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that her confidence rested on one assumption, that I had nothing to protect, nothing to lose, nothing worth fighting over, because people only bother to control what they believe will benefit them. I did not cry that night, not because I wasn't hurt, but because hurt had already done its worst, and what remained was something steadier, something sharper, something that allowed me to think instead of react. I lay awake listening to the house breathe around me, the pipes ticking, the floors settling, and I understood that this was no longer about comfort or family. It was about positioning, and I had been placed at the bottom without being consulted. I decided then that silence would no longer be passive. It would be deliberate, that every word I heard would be remembered, that every glance, every tone, every careless sentence would be stored, because people who believe you are fading speak freely, and freedom makes them sloppy. I began to see how quickly her language shifted when guests were present, how concern replaced contempt in public, how her kindness performed better when witnessed, and that contrast told me everything I needed to know. By the end of that week, I was no longer confused about my place in their home. I was an inconvenience they were preparing to resolve. And the most dangerous part was not that they wanted me gone, it was how confident they were that I wouldn't notice what was coming next. Because once people stop seeing you as human, they start treating your life like paperwork. And a few days later, they proved it when she showed up with a smile, a notary, and papers she thought I would sign without reading. Have you ever noticed how people act unusually calm when they believe the outcome is already decided? How their kindness becomes efficient and their smiles arrive too early, like applause before the curtain even lifts? That was the feeling in the house the morning she told me we had a quick appointment. The way her voice floated lightly over breakfast, as if she were suggesting a walk instead of orchestrating something she had clearly rehearsed. Because when I came downstairs, she was already dressed, composed in a way that felt deliberate, papers stacked neatly beside her purse, my name written where it didn't belong, and my son sat quietly at the table, eyes fixed on his coffee like it might offer him an escape. She said it was nothing serious, just a few documents to help simplify things, because at my age, she explained, organization was kindness, and kindness, when repeated often enough, starts to sound like authority. I nodded because nodding buys time, and time reveals intentions, and I wanted to see how far she would go now that she believed I was compliant. When the doorbell rang, she stood before either of us could move, smoothing her blouse as if greeting someone important, and when she opened the door, a man stepped inside carrying a small case and a practiced neutrality, introducing himself as a notary, and that word alone changed the temperature of the room, because no one invites a notary over for casual conversation. She gestured toward the dining table like a hostess presenting a meal, laying out papers I had never seen before, thick with legal language and clipped together with confidence, and she explained, slowly and sweetly, that these were just formalities, nothing to worry about, just signatures to ensure everything was handled properly if something ever happened to me, because she cared, because family cared, because she wanted to help. I noticed how she avoided specifics, how every explanation was circular, how questions were answered with reassurance instead of clarity, and how my son still had not said a word, his silence louder than any argument. The notary asked if I understood why he was there, and she answered for me before I could open my mouth, explaining that I sometimes got confused, that it was easier this way, that she didn't want to overwhelm me, and the ease with which she spoke on my behalf told me she had practiced this version of me in her mind for a long time. I picked up the papers slowly, letting my hands shake just enough to confirm her expectations, and glanced over the first page, then the second, recognizing the shape of control even before I understood the details. Because legal language has a smell to it, cold and precise, and this smelled like surrender disguised as support. She watched me closely, her smile tightening each time I paused, and I realized she was not worried I wouldn't sign, she was worried I would read. My son finally spoke then, telling me it was just to make things easier, that they wanted to help manage things so I wouldn't have to stress, and I saw the relief in his eyes when I nodded again, because agreement is easier than courage, and he wanted this moment to pass. I asked what would happen after I signed, and she laughed lightly, waving her hand as if I were asking about weather, saying nothing would change, that this was just protection, that I could trust her, and trust, when demanded instead of earned, becomes a warning. The notary asked if I was signing of my own free will, and I said yes, because free will is a funny thing when pressure wears the mask of care, and I wanted them comfortable, wanted them certain, wanted them careless. I told them I needed time to look things over properly, and she stiffened for just a second before recovering, saying, of course, but there was urgency in her voice now, reminding me that delays could complicate things, that paperwork had timelines, that efficiency mattered, and I wondered how long she had waited for this moment, how many assumptions had stacked themselves into confidence. I took the papers upstairs with me, my son watching as if unsure whether he should stop me or let me go, and once alone, I sat on the bed and let the mask fall just long enough to feel the weight of what they were attempting. Because this wasn't about helping me, it was about positioning themselves between me and my life, about control over decisions I hadn't yet been denied, about treating my existence like a loose end to be tied off neatly. I didn't cry because tears would have clouded my thinking, and I needed clarity more than comfort. So I read slowly, carefully, recognizing terms that granted authority, that transferred rights, that limited my voice under the guise of protection, and the audacity of it almost impressed me, because it was bold, efficient, and built entirely on the belief that I was too tired, too lonely, too weak to question it. When I went back downstairs, I handed the papers back and told her I would think about it, and the smile she gave me then was thinner, sharper, edged with impatience she could no longer hide, because certainty, once shaken, turns brittle. The notary packed his case, clearly sensing tension he was trained not to acknowledge, and when the door closed behind him, the house felt heavier, like something unfinished had been left on the table between us. She told me we could revisit it soon, that this was for the best, that I would see, and my son nodded again, a reflex now, and I realized then that they thought this was the beginning of the end for me, that in their minds the hardest part was over, because they had already decided who I was. They believed I was poor, dependent, and fading, and that belief made them reckless, because when people stop seeing you as capable, they stop protecting themselves from you. I went to my room that night with a calm I hadn't felt in months, because the shape of their plan was finally clear, and clarity turns fear into focus, and focus into preparation. Because the moment they brought those papers into my home, they crossed a line they didn't even know existed. And instead of refusing, I did something far more dangerous. I let them believe I didn't understand a word of it. Have you ever realized that pretending not to understand can be far more powerful than arguing? Because when people believe you are slow, they stop hiding their speed. That was the strategy I chose the moment those papers left the dining table, because refusal would have alerted them, anger would have hardened their tactics, but confusion invited comfort, and comfort invites mistakes. I began to play the role they had already written for me, not dramatically, not obviously, but in small, believable ways that confirmed their assumptions without raising suspicion, asking the same question twice, forgetting where I placed my glasses even when they rested in my pocket, pausing mid-sentence as if searching for words that never came, and every time I did, I watched relief soften her face. Watched confidence bloom where caution should have lived. She corrected me gently at first, then impatiently, then openly, because power grows loud when it believes it is safe, and soon she no longer waited for me to finish thoughts before finishing them herself. My son noticed the change too, but he interpreted it the way she wanted him to, as decline instead of design, and that realization hurt more than I expected, because it meant he had already accepted a version of me that required less responsibility from him. I let the days blur just enough to make my presence feel uncertain, leaving cabinets open once, misplacing a dish, lingering too long in doorways as if unsure where I meant to go, and she responded exactly as predicted, with concern sharpened into control, suggesting routines, monitoring my movements, offering help that felt less like assistance and more like supervision. She began speaking about doctors, about evaluations, about just checking things, and I nodded along, grateful on the surface, observant beneath, because people who plan to take something need justification, and justification requires documentation. I noticed how she framed everything in terms of protection, how she spoke of safety while limiting my independence, how she repeated phrases like "for your own good" and "at your age," because language is the first cage built before any door is locked. My son withdrew further, relieved perhaps that decisions were being made without requiring his spine, and I saw how easily responsibility transfers when someone else is willing to carry it, even cruel responsibility. At night, alone in my room, I stopped grieving and started cataloging, not on paper at first, but in memory, because memory sharpens when it knows it will be needed. And I remembered dates, tones, exact words, the way her voice shifted when she thought no one was listening, the way she spoke about me as if I were already absent, already reduced to a concept rather than a person. I began to notice patterns in her confidence, how it spiked whenever she believed I had confirmed her narrative, how she smiled more when I appeared uncertain, how she relaxed when I appeared dependent, and it became clear that her power depended entirely on my performance. That realization steadied me because performances can be altered. I began to control what she saw, giving her enough decline to keep her satisfied, enough clarity to keep her curious, because uncertainty keeps predators circling rather than striking, and circling buys time. I paid attention to the way she watched me now, not with concern but with evaluation, as if checking boxes on an invisible list, and I understood that she was building a case, one that would justify whatever came next, whether that was paperwork, placement, or something quieter that didn't require my consent at all. I noticed how she spoke about money too, always hypothetically, always carefully, asking indirect questions about my savings, my accounts, my plans, and I answered vaguely, reinforcing the idea that there was little to manage, little to gain, and I could almost see her confidence recalibrating, shifting from greed to convenience, because if there was nothing to take, then removing me would simply clear space. That belief made her careless, and carelessness is the most generous gift an enemy can offer. I watched her stop checking herself, stop masking her impatience. Stop pretending I mattered, and in those moments she revealed more than she ever would have if I had challenged her openly. My son watched this transformation too, but he saw it through the fog of relief, relieved that someone else was handling what he did not want to face, relieved that his life did not have to change, and that quiet betrayal settled deeper than any insult because it was chosen daily. I did not confront him because confrontation requires an audience willing to hear, and he was not. Instead, I let the narrative continue, let her confidence grow, let her believe she was winning, because when someone believes victory is inevitable, they rush toward it without checking the ground beneath their feet. Inside, something had changed in me, something steady and cold and focused, a shift from endurance to intention, because grief had already taken everything it could from me, and I refused to let convenience take the rest. I was no longer reacting, I was preparing, and preparation is invisible until it is complete. Every nod, every pause, every small mistake was a piece of a larger design, one she could not see because she had already decided who I was, and people rarely look closely at what they believe they understand. Because while she was documenting my decline, I was quietly documenting her confidence. And the more confident she became, the closer she came to discovering a truth that would destroy everything she was planning to take. Have you ever watched someone reach for something they are absolutely certain belongs to them, never realizing they are standing on ground that was never theirs to claim? That was the moment I found myself in as her confidence hardened into entitlement because she no longer asked questions, she issued conclusions, and those conclusions were built on a lie she had never bothered to verify. She believed I was surviving on scraps, that my quiet meant dependence, that my hesitation meant confusion, and because of that belief, she began speaking more freely about what would happen after everything was settled. About changes she wanted to make, about space finally opening up, about how peaceful the house would feel once decisions were taken care of. And I listened without reaction, because reaction would have tipped my hand. What she never imagined, what never crossed her mind even once, was that the house she walked through with such authority did not belong to her husband, did not belong to her future, and had never been offered as a gift at all. Harold and I bought it years before, quietly, strategically, not as generosity but as opportunity, a place our son could grow into if he chose responsibility over entitlement. And when he married and moved in, we let him believe it was rented, because truth given too early becomes wasted. Every tax payment, every maintenance bill, every utility fee had been handled through a trust that never touched his name, never required his signature, and never invited his questions, because comfort has a way of dulling curiosity. I had watched them redecorate with confidence, tear out fixtures they disliked, repaint walls without asking, and it never bothered me, not because I didn't care, but because ownership does not require announcement when time is on your side. The more she spoke about control, the clearer it became that she thought the hardest part was convincing me, not realizing the real obstacle was a truth she had never bothered to seek. That was when I made my first call, not from the house, not from my phone, but from a place where no one would notice or question it, because discretion mattered now more than ever. The man who answered had known my husband for decades, had watched him plan for futures no one else could see, and when he heard my voice, there was no surprise, only understanding, because preparation recognizes preparation. I told him everything calmly, not emotionally, because emotion clouds strategy, and strategy was the only thing that mattered now. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a pause long enough to tell me he understood the gravity of what was unfolding, not as family conflict, but as something far more serious. He explained what I already suspected, that what she was attempting required justification, that paperwork does not move without narrative, and narrative requires proof, and as long as she believed I was declining, she would continue documenting behaviors to support her version of reality. He asked if I had anything concrete, anything recorded, anything preserved beyond memory, and I told him not yet, but that I was paying attention. That was when he told me attention would no longer be enough because people who plan to take control rarely stop halfway. They escalate, they accelerate, and once that machine starts moving, stopping it requires evidence that cannot be dismissed as confusion or resentment. I returned home that evening with a clarity that felt almost calm because fear thrives in uncertainty, and uncertainty had been replaced by direction. She noticed the change immediately, not in my behavior, but in my stillness, because stillness unnerves people who rely on reaction. And for the first time, I saw hesitation flicker across her face just briefly before she recovered and resumed her role. She began speaking about doctors more often now, about checkups, about evaluations, about how good people sometimes need help recognizing when they need help, and I nodded along because the shape of her plan was finally visible, and visibility turns threat into map. My son remained silent, but his silence had changed too, less passive now, more anxious because somewhere beneath his compliance, he sensed movement he could not control, and control, once lost, makes cowards nervous. I began documenting quietly, not with confrontation, but with preservation, noting dates, phrases, implications, because truth, when preserved carefully, becomes unmovable. I realized then that the inheritance itself was not the weapon, it was leverage, and leverage only works when revealed at the right moment, not before. To tell her now would have been pointless, even dangerous, because greed adapts faster than fear, and I needed her unprepared. I needed her confident. I needed her to continue believing she was steering this situation toward an inevitable outcome. That belief was doing more damage to her than anything I could say. I watched her stop disguising impatience entirely, watched her speak about my future as if it were already written, watched her correct my son when he hesitated, watched her take ownership of decisions she had no right to make, and every step she took forward without verifying her footing brought her closer to the edge she did not know existed. Inside me, grief had transformed into something unrecognizable, not anger, not hatred, but resolve, because when someone mistakes your silence for surrender, correcting them too early is mercy they have not earned. And by the time she decided it was finally time to make everything official, she had already handed me exactly what I needed to end it. Because the next time she put papers in front of me, I signed them, and that was the moment her control completely disappeared. Have you ever seen relief spread across someone's face too early? The kind of relief that comes from believing the battle is already over, because that was the expression she wore the morning she told me everything was finally ready, her voice almost celebratory as she laid the papers out again like a victory she could already taste. She had dressed carefully that day, composed and confident, as if presentation itself could guarantee outcome, and my son sat beside her with the same hollow posture I had grown used to, silent, resigned, already bracing for the aftermath he believed would never touch him. The notary returned, punctual and professional, setting his case on the table with practiced indifference, and I noticed how little attention she paid to him now, because in her mind he was just a formality, not a witness. She spoke quickly, summarizing what she had already decided I understood, telling the notary that I had been struggling, that this arrangement would protect everyone, that she was only acting out of care, and the ease with which she shaped the narrative confirmed what I already knew. She had convinced herself this version of events was truth. When the notary asked if I wished to review the documents again, she answered for me, smiling, explaining that we had already gone over everything. That repetition only confused me, and I let my eyes lower, my shoulders soften, my voice thin just enough to match the role she expected, because expectation is the doorway arrogance walks through. I asked a few simple questions, deliberately misplaced, deliberately shallow, and she responded with patience sharpened by urgency, because she wanted this finished, wanted certainty, wanted control secured before doubt could creep back in. The notary finally turned to me and asked if I was signing of my own free will, and I answered yes without hesitation, because free will, when underestimated, becomes invisible. I picked up the pen slowly, feeling the weight of the moment not as fear, but as precision, because everything had already been decided, just not in the way she believed. I signed exactly where instructed, using my full legal name, steady and clear, and I watched her exhale for the first time in weeks, watched tension leave her body as if she had crossed a finish line, because people who believe they have one stop paying attention to details. My son looked at the page, then at me, his eyes flickering with something that might have been doubt or guilt, but he said nothing because silence had become his language of choice. The notary stamped the documents, packed his case, and congratulated us politely, unaware that the papers he had just notarized were not instruments of control, but confessions wrapped in legal formatting. She gathered the documents eagerly, already talking about next steps, about appointments, about changes that would make life simpler. And I nodded, thanked everyone, and excused myself because the performance was over and there was nothing left to say. Upstairs, in the quiet of my room, I sat on the bed and allowed myself one slow breath, not of relief, but of certainty, because what I had signed was not surrender, it was disclosure, affidavits prepared carefully. Identical in appearance, but devastating in consequence, documenting coercion, misrepresentation, and attempted exploitation, all signed under penalty of perjury, all witnessed and validated without suspicion. The power she believed she had secured did not exist, because the moment those documents were filed, they triggered processes she could not stop, systems designed precisely for people like her who mistake authority for ownership. I did not celebrate, did not smile, did not feel triumph, because triumph is loud and invites retaliation, and retaliation was unnecessary now. Instead, I waited. She grew impatient over the next few days, irritated that nothing seemed to change immediately, that I was still there, that control did not arrive with the speed she expected. And I watched confusion replace confidence in small increments, because when plans depend on momentum, delays feel threatening. My son grew quieter still, sensing something had shifted without understanding what, trapped between fear and loyalty, and that tension began to show in his movements, his voice, his inability to meet my eyes. I remained exactly as I had been, calm, compliant, unremarkable, because invisibility was still my greatest advantage. Then the calls started, not to me, but to her, numbers she didn't recognize, messages she dismissed at first, because certainty makes people careless with warnings. I heard her voice change when she answered one call in the kitchen, the edge of irritation giving way to confusion, then to something sharper, something brittle, because explanations she was not prepared to give were suddenly being demanded. She glanced at me then, not with contempt but with suspicion, the first real crack in her composure, and I knew the shift had begun. She asked my son if he knew anything about what was happening, and he shook his head, fear replacing loyalty, because fear always abandons loyalty first. I returned to my room and closed the door gently, because there was nothing left for me to witness in that house. The ending was already in motion. I packed nothing, prepared nothing, said nothing, because the unraveling did not require my presence, only my patience. And 1 week later, her carefully built image collapsed in front of everyone she believed mattered. Because what happened next didn't happen in our home, it happened in public, where silence could no longer protect her. Have you ever noticed how quickly confidence collapses when it's exposed to daylight? How people who thrive in shadows crumble the moment witnesses appear? Because that was exactly what happened when her world finally stopped being private. The unraveling did not begin with shouting or confrontation or dramatic accusations. It began quietly, the way all irreversible things do, with doors opening she did not expect and questions she was not prepared to answer, because 1 week after I signed those papers, the illusion she had built so carefully cracked in front of everyone she believed mattered. She had dressed that morning like someone expecting praise, her posture upright, her voice rehearsed, her smile ready for rooms filled with polite applause, because she thought she was stepping into recognition, not consequence, and my son followed her like a man walking toward something he could no longer stop. I was not beside them, not visible, not involved, because the most effective justice does not require presence, only timing. The room went silent when unfamiliar faces entered, men whose expressions did not bend to charm or explanation, men who spoke plainly and moved deliberately, and I imagined the moment it registered for her that this was not a misunderstanding, because confidence drains fastest when certainty disappears all at once. There were words read aloud she had never expected to hear spoken publicly, phrases that stripped away her performance and replaced it with facts, and I know she searched the room for allies who did not exist, because people who benefit from silence rarely defend truth. My son stood still, frozen in a way I recognized immediately, the same stillness I had felt months earlier in the hallway, except now it belonged to him, and I wondered briefly if he understood how long this moment had been forming. By the time she was escorted out, her voice had lost its careful polish, her posture its authority, and whatever version of herself she believed would protect her dissolved under scrutiny she could not redirect, because manipulation does not survive documentation. I did not watch from close enough to see her expression clearly, but I did not need to because I had seen it before in fragments, in flashes of irritation when control slipped, in moments of panic when certainty wavered, and I knew exactly what fear looked like on her. My son saw me afterward, not immediately, not boldly, but hesitantly, as if approaching a truth he was no longer sure he wanted. And when our eyes met, there was no anger in me, no satisfaction either, only a calm that confused him more than any accusation could have. He tried to speak, tried to explain, tried to rearrange responsibility into something manageable, but explanations are useless once they arrive too late, and I realized then that silence had taught me something important, that forgiveness offered prematurely only teaches people how much they can get away with. I left without ceremony, without speeches or ultimatums, because endings do not require drama when the lesson is complete, and I chose not to look back, because looking back invites negotiation, and negotiation was no longer necessary. In the days that followed, I handled what remained quietly, revoking permissions that should never have been granted, correcting assumptions that had been allowed to linger too long, not with anger, but with finality, because finality is the language boundaries speak fluently. I sent my son exactly what he had earned, not punishment, not cruelty, but truth, wrapped plainly and delivered without embellishment, because consequences do not need decoration. When he came to my door later, diminished and uncertain, carrying apologies shaped by regret rather than understanding, I listened without interrupting, because listening costs nothing when decisions are already made. And when he finished, I told him gently that love does not survive convenience, that loyalty is proven in discomfort, and that silence used to protect yourself while someone else is harmed is not neutrality, it is choice. I closed the door without raising my voice because raised voices invite argument, and there was nothing left to argue about. I left the city shortly after, not to escape, but to begin again without explanation, because explanations keep you tethered to people who only value you when you serve a purpose. Somewhere far from the rooms where I had been evaluated, managed, and dismissed, I rediscovered what quiet feels like when it is chosen rather than imposed, when silence becomes peace instead of armor. I woke up without monitoring, ate without permission, moved without being measured, and I understood then that freedom does not announce itself. It settles in slowly, like breath returning after a long illness. I thought of my husband often, of the way he planned without boasting, protected without controlling, and trusted patience more than force. And I knew he would have understood why I handled things the way I did, because he believed, as I do now, that power revealed too early loses its edge. This was never about revenge in the loud sense people expect, never about humiliation or spectacle. It was about balance, about restoring what was quietly threatened, about reminding myself that dignity does not expire with age and wisdom does not need permission to act. I did not win by shouting, I did not win by pleading, I did not win by exposing my wealth or my strength until it mattered. I won by letting them believe exactly what they wanted to believe until that belief destroyed them on its own. Because silence is not weakness, it is observation, and observation, when paired with patience, always outlasts greed. If this story reminded you that being underestimated can be a strategy, not a sentence, then remember this: the quietest person in the room is often the one holding the ending.